Hello, everybody. It's been a while. So I'm reading a book right now that I haven't finished yet, but I wanted to do a video partway through just because it's one of the most quotable books that I've ever read, and I was starting to realize that if I waited till I was finished, the video of quotes from the book would be way too long. So many of you know that I'm a history buff, and I've been a history buff since I was about 10. When I was 10, I visited the Battle of Gettysburg, the battlefield at Gettysburg, and I didn't really know anything about history at that point. And I found that experience really transformative in a lot of ways. And I started learning about history and kind of broadening and deepening my understanding first of the Civil War. I wanted to know, okay, well, this is this battle. What about the other battles? What about the lead up? What about what happened after? And for a long time, I was primarily interested in the war itself, the battles, the generals, the campaigns, the casualties, the prisons, the ships, all that stuff. And I still am interested in that, and that is a really interesting area to look at, and it's good to know about the battles and how they were won and how they were lost, and it's a wonderful area. But as I got older, especially after college, I started to get more interested in the lead up to the war. Why did this even happen? How did we get to the point where Americans were fighting Americans in this, intense struggle, far more intense struggle than anything that we've had before or since, really, with possible relative exceptions of some of the early Indian wars that were pretty intense for their relatively small numbers. And I found it both fascinating just to learn that history, to understand it better. I want to understand it better and better. It's not a question of knowing it so you have it perfect. I don't think that's such, you can't ever have perfect understanding, but you can understand something better and deeper and make, more rational assessments of it the more you know. So I just found that personally very interesting. And then there was also this idea, like you can find fantasy interesting. It's really great to enjoy great fantasy books, say Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. Those are wonderful. Just to take two of the most popular examples, Harry Potter. It's easy to get into those things, and I have enjoyed some of that stuff. But at the end of the day, that stuff is fantasy, and whatever insights they do and certainly can have about reality, the world building, all that is a fictional world. Whereas when you learn history, you're learning about this world, and you're deepening your understanding of the world that we live in now. And we can say that something like the Civil War is archaic and doesn't really matter. It's a way in the past. Who cares? And yet now it seems to have become completely relevant. And so, I've been looking into slavery specifically for a long time. And if we look, this bookshelf here is my 19th century American history shelf. The bottom two are slavery. These are antebellum stuff. So and I haven't read all of them, but I read plenty of them, maybe about half of the slavery ones. And that stuff has served me really, really well in what's been happening recently. It's been very interesting to see all these discussions about slavery and how it's been invoked in such a contemporary political way. And I didn't anticipate that happening, by the way. I didn't start reading about the Civil War and slavery because I thought one day BLM is going to be a thing, and I'm going to, potentially be in these debates about slavery and its role in American society today, or Jim Crow, or whatever else it is. And so I want to have ammunition for those discussions when they come. I didn't anticipate that they would come up in the way that they have. I just thought this is interesting. I want to know about this, and potentially it will help me understand the United States better than it already did. So in that vein, 2 summers ago, I listened to the audiobook of Battle Cry of Freedom by James McPherson, which is, one of the, it's very good. It's a more generic, traditional view of the Civil War. Now, McPherson has many personal flaws when it comes to the fact that he's basically a New Deal Democrat. He's a big government guy. So when he looks at the Civil War, he looks at it through that lens. And I think that's a fair criticism, by the way. I watched him on C-SPAN at one point, and a caller called in to point out the work of Tom DeLorenzo, who is a libertarian historian or economist, and who brings up all these points about Lincoln, not being an abolitionist, not, having all these views on tariffs and railroads that are quite corporatist or even fascist, and all the tyranny stuff, and suspending habeas corpus. And it was interesting. McPherson said, well, he didn't deny that, he didn't claim that De Lorenzo was wrong about anything. He just said, well, he's a libertarian, so you have to realize he's looking at it from a libertarian perspective. But you know what? That's actually perfectly fair, and we have to realize when we read McPherson that he's looking at it from a New Deal Democrat um, point of view. And so when he looks at something like the growth of the federal government, or increasing its power, or the abuse of its power, those aren't things that he necessarily disagrees with, right? He's a guy who would have voted for FDR 4 times if he had the chance. So that doesn't invalidate everything he said about the Civil War. Battle Cry Freedom is a great book. I would put it up there if you want to learn about the battles and everything. Shelby Foote's book is excellent, his 3-volume work. And then I would also probably put Battle Cry Freedom as the 2, like if you want a really good generic version. But then you have to realize he's got his biases in there. But he put a lot of stuff that's in there well. And he started quoting from this author who I heard the quotes and I was like, I have to read that book. And I'm going to read some of the quotes here today. But it's very interesting who gets remembered and who doesn't get remembered. And some of these people were, in terms of contemporary slavery politics, way more important than almost anybody else, and we never hear about them today. And I think with this case, you're going to see why with some of these quotes. So the author, if you haven't already guessed, and I'm going to think some of you probably already have, is George Fitzhugh. The name of the book, Cannibals All, or Slaves Without Masters, right here. And he has another title, Socialism, or no, the Sociology of Slavery, I want to say, which I believe is the first American title to have the term sociology in it. And this is a guy who is not just an apologist, but a proponent of slavery. So, you know, at the time of the American Revolution, the people who wrote about slavery tended to, even people who owned slaves and who favored its continuation and defended it as an institution, kind of saw it as a necessary evil or the lesser of two evils. They looked at the situation, they thought, well, maybe it's wrong, it has its problems, but what are we going to do to get rid of it? Getting rid of it would be even worse, blah, blah, blah. So these are people like Jefferson and Mason and John Randolph of Roanoke, and then later people like Henry Clay. These are people who really did have moral misgivings about slavery, but themselves owned slaves. And it wasn't just that they were hypocrites; they were certainly somewhat hypocritical. But they said, "What are we going to do? Free my slaves into a world where they will be persecuted legally?" Blah blah blah. I'm not justifying their positions necessarily; just saying they weren't, you know, bloodthirsty, cackling, evil people. They had human failings like the rest of us. They were hypocrites about a lot of things like the rest of us. But the thing about it was that they weren't really saying slavery's awesome and slavery's great and we should expand it. There weren't very many people who said that. People would defend it. They would look to, especially the Bible, and also to a lesser extent Aristotle. Aristotle did write about slavery a decent amount and condone it. But many, many slave owners weren't comfortable with this. And then you get a guy named George Fitzhugh coming up, writing in the 1850s, and he positively loves slavery and he hates capitalism and he loves socialism. And this is, I think, why you don't hear about him too much. And I'll have some more things to say at the end here. This is going to go kind of into the general line of the idea that slavery caused capitalism, or that slavery and capitalism are somehow linked at the hip, and that they deserve each other, created each other, born each other. There's this theory popular among Marxists that's now becoming increasingly popularized among the general left. And you can see this with things like the 1619 Project and other works, that slavery is responsible for capitalism and capitalism carries some kind of guilt. And it's very interesting here. They really take kind of the critical theory approach to this. So the critical theory is the idea that you use radical deconstruction on the ideas that you don't like, but you do this strategically. Now, you can radically deconstruct any idea, but the idea with critical theory is you only radically deconstruct the ideas that you don't like. So you don't radically deconstruct Marxism. You don't radically deconstruct the federal government or labor unions or things like that. But you do radically deconstruct, or the Democratic Party, ironically, but you do radically deconstruct capitalism, churches, families, you know, states' rights to that extent, whatever, right? You use it quite, right? So these people who write books, a good example is The Half Has Never Been Told, which is actually a good book in a lot of ways. You know, he's like, basically, this slavery taints capitalism, it taints the Industrial Revolution, but it doesn't taint the federal government, it doesn't taint labor unions, it doesn't taint socialism. But why? So there's kind of this selective blue, but seeing this deconstruction coming, pointing out the hypocrisy and how it's used is one thing, but just knowing the history is another. And this came in way back, even before BLM. You know, and I've related this story before. I read a book about slavery in the Caribbean, you know, and how what's a much bigger deal in terms of the number of slaves and the period of time under consideration than slavery in the United States was. Not to minimize slavery in the United States, but it was a more broadly practiced in Latin America, especially Brazil, but also places like Hispaniola and Cuba and Colombia. And I mean, we have this idea that Mexico didn't have slavery. Mexico had only very recently abolished slavery when we defeated Mexico in the Mexican-American War. There may have still been living slaves in Cuba at the time, since they did a gradual emancipation, not a blanket emancipation. And of course, slavery was practiced all over Africa, the Arab world, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, I read that book, and not a week later, I went on a date with a communist in Harvard who started lamenting that slavery was responsible for everything in Boston. And if I had been a neophyte who didn't know anything, I might have found that persuasive. But knowing what I did about the North Atlantic slave trade and its history, I knew that that was pure bullshit. And I asked him if we were walking around the streets of Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo or Lisbon, or never mind Lusaka, if he would say, oh, slavery built all this, even though their economic historical ties to slavery are, if anything, much, much stronger, definitely much, much stronger than anything you can find in New England. And he said no. And I said, okay, well, you're a hypocrite then. But anyway, I mean, he's a communist, so what do you expect? So I could do this. There'll be more videos about this topic. It hasn't really, I mean, it could be done to death. I've talked about it before. I'll talk about it again. But I'm going to go ahead and just start reading some of these quotes. And like, just to give you, this is not be the whole book. I encourage you to get the book, read the whole book. You know, this guy's love of slavery is paired with his hatred for capitalism. So, and this is the most explicit, overt defender of slavery that we have. We have nobody else who's being this categorical, and slavery is good, non-slavery is bad, here's why, and he's explicit about it. And, you know, he was so pro-socialist that a lot of Southerners actually were uncomfortable with him. But here we go. So let's see. And this is a unique for me. I've never read a book before where I actually took notes and like marked it up and wrote down where things were. And yeah, like it's so eminently quotable. And this, of course, because they didn't have public schools back then, so everybody was much more literate than they currently are. And that shows. So let's see. And, you know, these aren't going to be in a narrative order. I isolated these quotes because I thought that they were great. So we'll go from here. So this is on page 5. My chief aim has been to show that labor makes value, and wit exploits and accumulates them, and hence to deduce the conclusion that the unrestricted exploitation of the so-called free society is more oppressive to the laborer than domestic slavery. My chief aim has been to show that labor makes value, and wit exploits and accumulates them. Who is this? Is this Karl Marx? Is this Karl Marx? I wonder how many people in Black Lives Matter would disagree with that statement. No, probably very few. Very, very few. That's on page 5. Let's see. So now we're going to page 8. Challenge to compare and weigh the advantages and disadvantages of our domestic slavery with the slavery of the masses to capital and skill. It is moot, and neither accepts nor declines our challenge. The comparative evils of slave society and of free society, of slavery to human masters and of slavery to capital, are the issues which the South now presents and which the North avoids. And she avoids them because the abolitionists, the only assailants of Southern slavery, have, we believe, to a man asserted the entire failure of their own social system, proposed its subversion, and suggested an approximating millennium or some system of free love, communism, or socialism as a substitute. So this is an allusion that the abolitionists were quite radical. They had different views. They all didn't agree, but very few people were abolitionists and then just kind of normal moderates on every other issue. They tended to have a basket of radical ideas on a whole bunch of other things. So someone like William Lloyd Garrison, for instance, was what they called a non-resistor, or what we would say today would be like a pacifist, somebody who didn't believe that you could ever use violence. Now, he eventually changed his mind with John Brown in the Civil War, but that hadn't happened at this point. He was basically a pacifist. He wasn't alone. And this could go into all other kinds of things: sexual revolution, communism, socialism. So he's just pointing out that they weren't exactly necessarily proponents of free labor. Free labor was a more moderate position, and the people who were talking about free labor tended not to want to end slavery. Let's see, what's going on, page 15. This is just, again, you read this and you're like, this could be somebody today talking about today to a large extent. We are all, North and South, engaged in the white slave trade, and he who succeeds best is esteemed most respectable. It is far more cruel than the black slave trade because it exacts more of its slaves and neither protects nor governs them. We boast that it accepts more when we say, we boast when it exacts more when we say that the profits made from employing free labor are greater than those from slave labor. The profits made from free labor are the amount of the products of such labor which the employer, by means of the command of which capital or skill gives him, takes away, exacts, or exploits from free labor. So here we go. This is, again, labor. Most people call the labor theory of value. The Marxists will be pedantic and call the law of value. It's the idea that it's exploitation. And here's the point. You know, a lot of people in debates would say free labor is better than slave labor. Why? Well, it's more profitable. Well, why is it more profitable? Well, you're getting more value out of your slave. You know, when you have a slave, you have to pay for his housing and for his health care and for his upbringing and for his retirement, right? You have to do basically all the things that socialists think that you should do. And so it's not as profitable. And of course, the slave can be lazy, and you kind of have to deal with that. You can't fire your slave, really. You can sell them, and then that whoever buys them has the same problem that you had. So this idea that you have to, you know, with a worker, you just pay him to work, and then he's free, and then he has to take his pay, and he has to cover all of his own expenses with that, which he may not be able to do even. You know, may be so marginal that he doesn't even cover his own costs. So, you know, here we go. Isn't this an admission that free labor is more exploitative than slave labor? And again, slavery is basically giving the slaves what the socialists think we all should be given, right? We all should be in this position where we don't have to worry about this. So again, it is far more cruel than the black slave trade because it exacts more of its slaves and neither protects nor governs them. We boast that it exacts more when we say that the profits made from employing free labor are greater than those from slave labor. Yes, okay, continuing. These profits are less because the master allows the slave to retain a larger share of the results of his own labor than do the employees of free labor. But we not only boast that the white slave trade is more exacting and fraudulent, in fact, though not in intention, than black slavery, but we also boast that it is more cruel, in leaving the labor to take care of himself and family out of the pittance which skill or capital have allowed him to retain. When a day's labor is ended, he is free, but he is overburdened with the cares of family and household, which makes his freedom an empty and delusional mockery. But his employer is really free and may enjoy the profits made by others' labor without a care or trouble as to their well-being. The Negro slave is free too when the labors of the day are over, and free in mind as well as body, for the master provides food, raiment, fuel, and everything else necessary to the physical well-being of himself and family. The master's labors commence just when the slaves end. No wonder men should prefer white slavery to Negro slavery, since it is more profitable and is free from all the cares of labor of black slave holding. Again, so clearly he favors socialism, and he considers slavery the true socialism. And it is. I mean, they would deny, socialists would deny this and decry this, no question. But if you just say not slavery, right? If we're just talking, well, you shouldn't have to worry about your, you should be provided with food, raiment, fuel, and everything else necessary for the physical well-being of himself and his family. You shouldn't have to worry about that, right? You should be free from care and toil, and it's the responsibility of society to make those choices for you. You are enslaved by having to make those choices, and it's liberating to have someone else make those choices for you. And this is on page 15 and 16 on this edition. This is the Belknap Press, Harvard University, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Funny. Let's see. Somebody else had also read this book and marked it up pretty well, but I'm just doing the ones that I thought were really good, so let's do. Okay. The capitalists in free society live in 10 times the luxury and show that Southern masters do because the slaves to capital work harder and cost less than Negro slaves. So again, he's kind of turning the argument on its head. The argument was, you had this one of the sayings of the Republican Party was free labor, and the idea that free laborers are more efficient. And this is a common claim made. Uh, this is actually something that can be debated, and how do you measure efficiency or whatever. And you read things like coercion, consent, and let's see what else. The time on the cross reconsidered, competition and coercion. There's been a lot of academic research on here and philosophical writing on this, but there is an argument that it's cheaper to just hire somebody, right? When you just hire somebody, your upfront costs of hiring them are pretty low. When you buy a slave, you have to pay a lot of money for that slave, and then you're kind of stuck with them basically until you sell them or for life, either way, and you have to cover all their expenses, their food, their raiment, their health. If they get sick, that's on you. You can't just fire them. I mean, you still got to feed them and everything. So it's expensive, and then you just are taking on the responsibility of making all the choices for them, which is what socialists want society, they say the state or the commune or whoever else to do for you. So yeah, now this guy had read his Marx too. He's definitely read Marx. He talks about it, and he agreed with him to a very large extent. So let's see. So some of his so nothing written on the subject. This is page 18. Labor, skill, and capital. Right. This is something that labor, skill, and capital, that could be a chapter out of Das Kapital. Right. Although he writes, better than Marx. Marx wrote terribly. He's not as obtuse or tricky. He's more honest with what he believes. Nothing written on the subject of slavery from the time of Aristotle is worth reading until the days of modern socialists. Yeah. Hence, the works of socialists contain the true defense of slavery. Yes. Now you can. So you might be understanding why I wanted to read this book. Let's see. They were compelled to. This is page 24. They were compelled to labor for their landlords by fear of hunger and death. Forces stronger than the overseer's lash. They were worked more and did not get half so much pay or allowance as the Jamaican Negroes. He's talking about the abolition of slavery in Jamaica. So the English retained slavery in their Caribbean colonies after they abolished it at home until the 1820s and 30s. And so you have this position where they're freed, but they don't own the land, and they have to become workers, and that's what he's talking about. So he's just saying how emancipation doesn't really help. Now I wonder how different this would be if there had been major land reform and they've been given the land instead of just becoming, peasants, basically. 28. Interesting here. So, it is contrary to all, this is page 28. It is contrary to all human customs and legal analogies that those who are dependent or are likely to become so should not be controlled. The duty of protecting the weak involves the necessity of enslaving them. Hence, in all courtesies, women and children, wards and apprentices, have been essentially slaves, controlled not by law, but by the will of the superior. This is the fatal defect of the poorhouse, and it goes on and on. So this is an interesting thing. If you are telling somebody that you can't take care of yourself, that you can't make these decisions, and if that's your actual belief that they can't make these decisions, then it doesn't make sense to give them freedom, right? If you say that you are not capable of making choices about your health care, about your diet, about where you work, about your wages, about whatever else, any other thing, then we're just saying you really don't have the right to autonomy. You don't deserve it. It's not something that you are capable of having, and so rightly you shouldn't have it. And who should you have to listen to? Well, whoever it is who's responsible enough to pay for you to cover your things. Whoever's paying you, whoever's giving you food, whoever it is who's, quote, taking care of you, they own you. You should be their slave, right? The duty to, and you can also see here, look, he's protecting the weak. Right? We're just helping people who can't help themselves. A child can't help themselves, right? We're protecting them by making them slave. Um, yeah, and you see this kind of refrain throughout. This idea, you can't be free, and have everything taken care of from you. Like there are two sides of the same coin, and you can't be free when whatever the state or the collective is not if not making all your choices, making some substantial fraction over the most important ones: your work, your wages, your health care, your education, all those things. Right? The idea that you don't have the right to make those decisions, or you're not capable. And here's the idea. The idea is that they're not capable of making this. The blacks are not capable. The children are not. The women are not. Um, and of course, there's a little bit of self-reinforcement here, where you prevent somebody from establishing those skills. Right? If you just prevent somebody from uh, being successful, or you prevent somebody from learning anything or having any autonomy, then they won't be able to practice their autonomy very well, because that's something that takes practice, right? It takes time to develop the character and the skills, the job skills, the social skills, the interpersonal skills, the self-discipline to kind of manage your affairs. And I'll be fair here, like, people vary wildly in their abilities, and there are certainly people who, you can give them all the autonomy in the world, and the future for them isn't going to end, with a blinding success that all will be in awe of. There will be many people who, the limit of what they're likely to achieve, never, with the exceptions of there are people who get very lucky or whatever, but is not going to be something that's inspirational, and might even be something that's quite sad in some cases. I think with the advent of capitalism and markets, the freedom of labor, that most people actually can get something that's comfortable, or it may not be impressive, but they'll be able to pay the bills and be okay. They're not going to be inspirational. But that is hardly something that you can know a priori that's going to happen. That's also not something that's worth enslaving them for. And the idea that they can voluntarily give up some autonomy, when it comes to work, when you do wage labor, you are to some extent surrendering some autonomy. You're saying, okay, I'll do what you say, but you'll pay me this under these conditions, under these times, or whatever. You're not saying, but then you get to make choices for the rest of my life. But what the socialists would say was, well, really, everything is society, and if you're not going to take care of yourself, you have an obligation for society to rule you, and so would the slave master. So here, page 32 of Cannibals All. Capital exercises a more perfect compulsion over free laborers than human masters over slaves. For free laborers must at all times work or starve, and slaves are supported whether they work or not. Free laborers have less liberty than slaves, are worse paid and provided for, and have no valuable rights. Slaves, with more of actual practice of liberty, with ampler allowance and constant protection, are secure in the employment of all the rights which provide for their physical comfort at all times and under all circumstances. The free laborer must be employed or starve, and yet no one is obliged to employ him. The slave is taken care of whether employed or not, though each free laborer has no particular master. His wants and other men's capital make him a slave without a master, or with too many masters, which is as bad as none. If it were often better that he had an ascertained master instead of an irresponsible and uncertain one. So you're going to work for a boss or starve. Right now, he's probably drawing this from Marx, but he's agreeing with it. There's this horrible thing. If you don't have somebody to take care of you, then you might starve. Now there's a little bit of a ethical fallacy there, that, well, it's their fault or they have culpability. It's the person who's not helping you is the one who made you starve. No, it's just the fact that you have a body that needs energy, and that energy is just not readily available everywhere all the time, right? It's out there, but you got to work to get it. You have to work for the collective or starve too. So this is something that, again, you can radically deconstruct the capitalism, do this. I've seen this many, many times. I remember many years ago a guy who was a Ron Paul supporter, and then he just broke down with this idea of, I mean, yeah, you're free to have a job, but if you don't, you have to work. So you're not really free because you're going to starve. Yeah, you have to work in socialism too. I mean, somebody does. Somebody's got to do it. Like, I mean, sure, you might be on welfare and never work, but somebody has to work. And sure, your parents could just, I mean, you don't, in capitalism, there's lots of people who never really work or work very little and they get subsidized by somebody, by a relative, a welfare agent, whatever. So, uh, you're compelled and therefore you're not really free. And at least your master then has to take care of you. And the last one for now, and there'll be more. So I'm only on page 40 here. And there's just so many, it continues in this vein constantly. Uh, it's not the most readable book in terms of narrative, but like it's just full of gems like this. And the thinking here is so, it's like you could superimpose his thoughts onto not only a Marxist contemporary with his time, but a Marxist of today. And there would be so much overlap that they would be almost indistinguishable in almost every sense. Hmm. He was using his capital as a power to compel others to work for him. For whom did he not work at all? The white laborers who made his income or interests and dividends were wholly neglected by him, because he did not know even who they were. He treated his Negro slaves much better, it was true. He appropriated or exploited much of the results of their labor, but he governed them and provided for them with almost paternal affection. Some of them we knew who feigned to be unfit for labor, he was boarding expensively. Yeah, this is apparently a pretty common thing where they would pretend to be tired so they wouldn't have to work or whatever. Just something you had to deal with. So that's all I have for now on him. There'll be much more. I realized that by the time the book was over, and I'm reading this book in little sections. I'm reading other books at the same time. But it continues on and on and on in that vein. But there's this idea that uh, you're you're going to be compelled by somebody, might as well be by a master who will then take the time to govern you and to rule your life, and then you don't have to worry about that. And that's actually a really common, it's a common impulse that a lot of people have, but there's a lot of people who are stressed out with being alive and with having autonomy. They don't like to have to make decisions. They don't like to have to, stress and worry and get frustrated about what am I going to do about school and what am I going to do about work and what do I do? How do I juggle this and how do I juggle that? And I don't. They just, some people do like just to be told, this is what you're going to do. This is what you're going to do, and they want to be, to the extent that they surrender their autonomy, to be slaves, right? This is very common. People do it sexually, but they also just do it like beyond sexually, right? It goes beyond that. But then there's the people who maybe they don't necessarily feel that themselves, or maybe they do, but then who see this as beneficent or see this as laudable, right? This would be good. You shouldn't have to worry about this. What's the big thing? You shouldn't have to worry about your health care. You shouldn't have to worry about education or food. You shouldn't have to worry about starving, right? You should just be able to fucking finger paint and play cello or whatever you want. But of course, you can't just do whatever you want. You do have to do some work. So there's going to be some kind of um, compulsion here. And that compulsion ultimately means that you have to have a master who's going to rule over you. Now, whether that master is a plantation owner, from the South, or a politician, or a bureaucrat, doesn't really make that much of a difference, ideologically speaking or practically speaking. So uh, I think that the reason that we don't hear about this guy is because he is too close to the mark, that he makes the race pushers today, right, the history pimps of slavery, really, really uncomfortable. I mean, I'm sure none of them, or very, very few of them, have read him or are aware of them, because most of them are completely historically regular. I mean, they see claims by Marxists who have read other Marxist historians, maybe, and they just kind of accept that uncritically, and that's as far as they know. They haven't actually read the history. They don't know shit all about the North Atlantic slave trade, right? When I told the Harvard communist, like himself actually taught sociology there, that uh, there were more slaves in Brazil, and that the Portuguese were the biggest slave traders that was news to him. I mean, he didn't deny it. I think he must have realized, well, that sounds plausible, I guess, but he just never even occurred that fact had never been brought to his attention because it didn't fit the narrative that he had, which was that uh, capitalism was created by slavery. And this is again an argument that you'll see by people who aren't necessarily Marxist, people like The Half Has Never Been Told by Baptiste. I had to check it out right there. Um, it's fascinating, just the arguments there, to run over them very briefly, are really poor because slavery's been around since time immemorial, right? We've always had slavery. We've had several societies that had massive amounts of slavery where it was a central part of their economy and society. Classical Greece is a good example. The Romans are an even better example. But endemic in Arab culture, in Chinese culture, Native Americans, even prehistoric Neolithic, Mesolithic people practiced some form of slavery, although albeit in perhaps different forms. But I brought that up to the socialists. I said, well, slavery's been around forever. If slavery is what causes the Industrial Revolution, why did it not begin in Athens or in Rome in 58 BCE? And he said, no, no, no. Sophisticated Harvard argument here. Wait, brace yourselves. I'm talking about something very specific, the North Atlantic slave trade. I'm like, oh, the North Atlantic slave trade that began in the mid 1400s, right, in the mid 15th century, with the Reconquista of Spain and the Spanish and the Portuguese taking Arab slaves and then North African slaves. And as they started to explore down the coast of South Africa, taking slaves from Guinea and Gabon, bringing them back, starting sugar plantations on the Canaries, whatnot, kicking into high gear after Columbus, and they visited Latin America. And at first they tried to enslave the local population. That proved difficult for two reasons. One, they would run away. B, they got sick and died. And there was a demographic catastrophe in the Caribbean in the 15 teens and 20s where that population basically went the way of the Neanderthals. I'm sure there's some of their genes, made through mestizas, but like they were wiped out basically as a population through disease probably, and through atrocities committed by the Spanish. And you just pick up this slave trade in Africans right then, and it continues all the way up until the 1880s. And of course, the number one destinations were in the Caribbean and in Brazil. The Portuguese were the biggest at this. The Spanish were probably the second. You also have the Dutch, the English, and the French playing lesser roles, but still significant roles. Okay, so starts in 1550, ends in 1880. Locus of activity would probably have to be in Brazil or northern Brazil or also in Africa. So obviously the Industrial Revolution starts in the UK in the last decade or two of the 18th century, and in the United States in the 1820s in Lowell, Massachusetts, right? Why did it not start in the Chesapeake? Why did it not start in New Orleans? Why did it start in Lowell, right? Lowell, there had been some slavery in New England. I mean, that's a little factoid that people don't tend to realize. It wasn't very widespread, and it had been abolished either directly or through graduated emancipation, the American Revolution. So there probably weren't any slaves in Boston. How many buildings have been built by slaves, or let alone exclusively by slaves, in Boston in 1820? Good question. Of course, the Industrial Revolution doesn't begin in Boston. It begins in Lowell on the Merrimack River. And so it's really doesn't seem like much of a correlation there at all. There's different, starting at a completely different time and in basically a totally different place. And the argument is, well, cotton was the slave trade was really important. Deidre McCloskey goes over this very well in her Bourgeoisie Dignity series, that the fraction of foreign trade, just all foreign trade, slave trade, everything else to the British economy was pretty small. It was, it's relative to things like coal, just regular agriculture, right? So this idea that slavery was the big juggernaut that made it all tick, that doesn't really make sense. It also doesn't make sense, then why would they abolish it? And why did it do so well when it was destroyed, right? If it was this thing, the linchpin that made it possible, then why did capitalism do just great when slavery was abolished? And why were they so willing to abolish it? And now there were people in New England, for instance, there were the so-called cotton wigs. So these were people in Massachusetts primarily who were in the Whig Party, and they basically, hey, we want to get along with the South because we get all of our cotton from there, and that's what's running our textile mills. Of course, with other products too, like wool. But they weren't saying that they just needed the cotton. They didn't need the slavery, and there are other ways to get it other than slavery, as we discovered quite easily when slavery was over. The UK also discovered this, right? There's this big feeling in the South that the Civil War, the UK would intervene because, well, they need the cotton to run all their textile mills, and that's their big industry, and they'll come in and help us because they need it so bad. Nah, they just got their cotton from Egypt and India, right? And there was a dislocation. It wasn't great, but they had a surplus the year before, and that was enough to get them through to start new production, and they were fine. Prices went up a little bit, stimulating more production and more supply, and it was fine. It wasn't that big of a deal. So it's this totally vital thing that's totally linked to capitalism, but then capitalism's happy destroying it, right? The New Englanders were happy to fight the Civil War quite encouragingly. They weren't doing it to end slavery necessarily, at least the vast majority of them. They're doing it for nationalistic reasons, which is another myth that needs to be addressed more and more. But they certainly didn't think that they needed it, and certainly did fine. Capitalism did not end in 1865. It got stronger through the last few decades of the 19th century and continued to get stronger right on through. So, and by 1900, I think even a lot of socialists were like, wow, things are not getting worse for the workers, despite the fact that all these slaves have been freed. So it really, and it's very interesting too, like if you read, so what I think is that what Baptiste's book, The Half Has Never Been Told, which I did a review on, it's interesting because he does say that there was a shift in slavery, right? You had the original type of slavery, which was you'd have a farm, you'd have slaves, and you would yes, there'd be a lot of tobacco planting, but you'd also plant rice and other things, and your slaves would be multitasking. And there's this more kind of paternal idea, which, by the way, if you read American Slavery, American Freedom, which I highly recommend people read, it shows the start of slavery really is tied to feudalism and the ideas that you should have a gentry that doesn't have to work and then lay people who do, and there's a reciprocal obligation there, very much like the serf and the lord. You do the work, he gets most of the money, he takes care of you though, and is protecting you, and that's your place, that's where you belong. And slavery kind of fit into that. Now, not initially actually owning slaves in Virginia didn't make a lot of sense because the mortality rate was so high. You didn't want to buy somebody for life who would die in 1 year, which because the first decade or two of the Virginia colony, most immigrants did die within a year. We still don't know exactly why. Presumably diseases or starvation or Indians killing them. Indians did kill quite a few people in the early years. But you would get an indentured servant because they were cheaper, and then they were more likely to get your money back. With a slave, if you pay for life and they die a year later, you just got fucked. But it developed from feudalistic ideas, not capitalist ideas. They were anti-capitalist ideas. They were ideas that had held back capitalism for many years. So this is another thing the bourgeoisie dignity brings up, is this idea there was an intellectual shift, that it's okay to make money, that it's okay to do your own thing and not have to say, oh, society says that you should just be a peasant and just be satisfied with that and not more, and not want to make the best for yourself. You should just be satisfied with what you're given and be secure in the knowledge that you work hard and then you'll have enough to survive, and then the Lord or the priest or whoever it is will give you absolution and give you order in the world, and they'll make all the big decisions and you can just be have your little part to play. And I'm denigrating that, but not I mean, there is something to that people do like knowing their place and having a purpose and knowing what they're for. But to coerce them into that is going way too far, and then you're causing all these negative opportunity costs by doing that. Not to sound economical about something that's a moral tragedy, but it's true. But what Baptiste's book shows is there was a shift, with the creation of the cotton gin and the rise of these mass industry in New England. All of a sudden there was much more demand for cotton, and so slavery shifted from the areas where it had traditionally existed, namely the Chesapeake, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, to the cotton states, the cotton belts, places where cotton could be grown. These big plantations in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, and in those areas, especially Mississippi and Alabama, but a couple others. And you monocropped and you just drove, and the more cotton you can make, the better. And this is when you get to the driving and the chain gangs, and just go cotton, pick, 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 pick. Uh, and what I think he's failing to see there is that it was capitalism that transformed slavery, not slavery that created capitalism. Because when slavery ended, capitalism just took right off, no problem. It had already taken off, before. Slavery existed before. Slavery changed because of the markets. And I also should point out that the high intensity, high yield slavery that is the stuff that we think about when we think about the Civil War. We are totally fixated on like the 1830s, 40s, and 50s in our concept of slavery, and even a couple places we're not imagining slavery in 1690 or 1740 in Virginia or Maryland or New York for that matter. We're thinking about Mississippi. We're thinking about the South. We're thinking about the Candyland from Django Unchained. That's what we imagine, right? Well, that of course Candyland that's fantasy on so many other levels, so it's maybe a bad example. But the idea was that type of slavery, that kind of market slavery or capitalist slavery, that depends very, very, very heavily on government subsidy. Now, you can have slavery without government subsidy, right? We have anarchist societies that have slavery. We have, societies that they don't have a state, and you have slavery. But you can't really have mass market capitalist slavery without a state, because you need something that forces them to stay there, that stops them from rebelling, that stops them from escaping, right? You can't run an industry if there is a 3 or 4% chance in any given year that your slaves will run away. And so you need some kind of apparatus to prevent this. So, I mean, I could do a whole video on the ways that the government at every different level subsidized slavery and how necessary it was. So you have suppression of anti-slavery material, right? Abolitionist material, books were suppressed in the South. You can ship them in the mail. You would be prosecuted for showing them. Free blacks suppressed in the South, right? You couldn't have people who look like slaves who were in the South, because they would obviously potentially want to end slavery. They could provide cover. How do you know? If it becomes much easier if you know, well, if they're black, they're a slave, and if they're white, they're not. And then it becomes practically much more possible. This is what happened in Brazil, by the way. Eventually, you had a larger and larger growth of freemen, and it just became impossible. A slave runs away and moves into the black part of town. How are you going to know he's a slave and not a freeman? Right? So all the southern states started restricting freemen, not initially, but earlier on, as it became a bigger and bigger industry. You just could not allow there to be any kind of constituency, politically or economically, of free blacks. And so you had to expel them, which they did. And then you also had to restrict them, right? If it's one thing, if you could be slave or you could be totally free, well, be totally free. But if you couldn't really be totally free, because you're still going to be restricted by all kinds of municipal regulations at every level, right? You're going to be forbidden from certain trades, living in certain areas, getting whatever else. Well, then what? You're going to escape slavery to peonage? Okay, well, some people still did it. It was still preferable to plenty of people, but not as many as otherwise. But then a big one is you need a large area that they can't run away from. If you can just skip the river into Illinois or Indiana and you're a freeman, people are going to be doing that en masse. And so you have to have some kind of legal requirement that they be brought back. And so you have a fugitive slave law. You have a fugitive slave law, and this becomes really important. This is why it's just a sticking point for Southern politicians. They absolutely needed this to happen. And both for the idea that it would bring some of the slaves back, but just to discourage slaves from running away in the first place. Hey, if you run away, you could be caught. There's no real, you gotta make it all the way to fucking Canada. You can't just cross the Ohio River and consider it good, or the Mason-Dixon line. You got to go that far. So there's this huge buffer area where you're still liable to be returned. And also just to allow their slave owners to take their slaves to those areas, to pass through them for market reasons. So like this type of intensive monocropping, this needed heavy subsidy from the states. And I could go on. I mean, there were laws against manumission. There were laws drafting poor whites to be in slave patrols, right? You'd have poor whites who didn't own slaves who would have to go out and form patrols to make sure there wasn't a rebellion. And of course, when there was a rebellion, who was overall going to stop it? I mean, when John Brown tried to lead a rebellion in Harper's Ferry, who stopped him? Who marched in to stop him? The federal government did. The federal government came to crush him. And there's no question that that's what would have happened with any slave revolt that would have happened up to that point. Right? It was the government that's going to come and crush them, and that's absolutely necessary. So for this type of slavery, right? If you want to have smaller scale slavery, like say the Native Americans might have had, You don't need a state for that to work. You just got to realize some of your slaves are going to run away, and you can't treat them that bad because you're living with them and they'll flee. And so, yeah. But when you have Uncle Sam, when Uncle Sam's got your back, you can use your whips as much as possible. You can monocrop them as much as possible. You can drive them. That was the term they used, to drive them to work, because they can, and you can buy them, right? You can pay a market rate because the chances that they run away are pretty low, right? Whereas if the chances even go up, even as marginal, I'm not imagining this scenario where 50% of the slaves run off in a given year. That's highly, highly, highly unlikely until basically the end. If there's a 3%, 5%, 1% chance in a given year that someone will run away, you can't pay $40,000 or the equivalent of $40,000 to buy one. Or you can't count on them being there. And if they just cross the river, and oh, by the way, your neighbors are allowed to read the Liberator, or anti, hear lectures by abolitionists or whatever, it's not going to work. So, this is the big dirty secret. The federal government just walks away from this clean, right? All this deconstruction, capitalism, this, markets, that, fucking Boston, fucking the North, New England, but like not the federal government at all. And even more ridiculous, not the Democrats. Like the Democratic Party is somehow erased from this. It's like people don't. It's like they latch on like a fucking leech onto these other aspects, and then they just completely like ignore the most blaring hypocritical part of it every time. It shows they're not good actors, but they're critical. They're Marxists, right? And they use critical theory in this kind of hypocritical way. But it's good to be able to see it. So anyway, this video is getting long, and they'll definitely move more. I haven't finished the book. Obviously, I'll upload more when I read more, because it's such an important book to read, to understand this is what the thinking was, and just see the parallels. They're not, to quote another author, another title, they're very ominous parallels here. Or from our perspective, very serendipitous, right? I mean, I love the fact that he wrote this book, right? It's wonderful to me to compare slavery and socialism, because I think that they are so ideologically consistent and similar with each other. They hark to each other, they call to each other. And then socialism is just, its entire history is a series of embarrassments that it likes to pretend are not there, right? Oh, it doesn't like to own up to the Soviet Union or to China or to Cambodia or East Germany. It doesn't like to own up to the non-aggression pact with Hitler, or putting Hitler in power in the first place. Not as well known, but just as well attested. And it doesn't like to put, to advertise its links to the Democratic Party and to their views on Jim Crow, or to eugenics, or to slavery itself. And yet they are true they're true bedfellows and fellow travelers. It's all right there in print. You can read it. You can read their own words. It's right there. So anyway, I hope you guys found this interesting. I'll do more videos soon. I'm sorry, I've been busy with other things, but I will be making more, and I will talk to you all then. Goodbye.